On part one, what exactly is the threat to peace in South China Sea? And if I have to be short and brusque and blunt, I have to oversimplify things and we can do the qualifications later. But there's basically a Western narrative and what I would say for shorthand form an Asian narrative. And the Western narrative is very clear, very stark, very direct. Why is there threat of war in South China Sea? It's because China has emerged as a great power, and with China's emergence as a great power, it is now threatening its Southeast Asian neighbors. It's reinforcing the islands in the South China Sea. It has a 9-dash line claiming all of South China Sea. And of course, you saw that when Philippines took China to the tribunal, China rejected it. And then Xi Jinping promised to demilitarize the South China Sea, and then he broke his promise. All this you can find, by the way, in my book As China Won, all the details. So the Western narrative is very stark, very clear. And as someone who travels around the world, I can tell you that the Anglo-Saxon media makes it clear there's only one narrative, and that's the correct narrative. But then what I call the Asian narrative, again, at the risk of oversimplification, that the problem in South China Sea is really not between China and the Southeast Asian countries. Is that this region is basically becoming a pawn in a much bigger geopolitical struggle that has emerged between the United States and China. And the real threat to this region doesn't come from China's aggression or China's assertiveness. It comes from the fact that now when the United States is looking for ways and means of embarrassing or bringing down China, it's very useful to use South China Sea as a weapon against China and use everything there and say, all this proves that China is aggressive, assertive, duplicitous, and so on and so forth. So I hope that's made it clear. These are the two narratives. But the next question is, which narrative is right? And I can tell you that in the Western world, there's a total conviction that the Western narrative is right and there's no other narrative to consider. And what is interesting, I find, is that you cannot even get agreement on what are the facts between the two cases. So I'll give you a simple example. I've spoken to so many people in Europe and the United States. They are absolutely convinced that Xi Jinping was completely duplicitous in promising to demilitarize the South China Sea and then reneged on his promise and went ahead and militarized the South China Sea. I haven't met a single person in the West who doubts this to be the truth. But I discovered, ironically, from a former American ambassador to China, who will go down as one of the best ambassadors of the United States ever to China. And some people in Singapore also know him very well because he also was a US ambassador to Singapore. His name is Stapleton Roy. He actually, as a child, grew up in China, speaks Chinese fluently, understands China very deeply. And when I was doing research for my book, Has China Won, I had a one-on-one lunch with him in Washington, D.C. And he told me, Kishore, at the meeting between Xi Jinping and Obama raised the subject of South China Sea and said, why are you being so assertive? And Xi Jinping told Obama, okay, if you think this is the problem, why don't both of us agree? We both of us agree to demilitarize the South China Sea, and neither China nor US will set up military facilities in South China Sea. And Stapleton Roy said to me, Kishore, we should have seized that offer and said, good, because what we would have accomplished is we would have got China to demilitarize an area right next to China. This is a gift to the United States. And Stapleton Roy said to me, stupidly, we rebuffed that offer and we stepped up the naval patrols. So instead of Xi Jinping being duplicitous and having reneged on his promise, he actually made an offer that was rebuffed. This is factually true, but completely unknown in the West. And what is for me shocking, the opening section of a whole chapter, I describe all this in great details, but the Anglo-Saxon media will never tell the alternative story. And one of the things that has become clear to me as I study this US-China contest as deeply as I can, is that the Anglo-Saxon media will tell outright lies, which for many in Singapore is very hard to believe because we have become prisoners of the Anglo-Saxon media, and so we cannot accept the fact that sometimes they're telling outright lies on some issue. And so especially when it comes to South China Sea, we must learn to be very wary of all the facts. So for example, I'll give you another example. They will talk about how much China has claimed land in its features in the South China Sea. But the question is, who started this process? Was it China or was it the other Southeast Asian claimants? And unfortunately, the Southeast Asian claimants started it. So China said, okay, if you do it, I'll do it. Only difference is that, if Malaysia can claim 20 acres, Chinese will claim 2,000 acres. So that's a game, right? So therefore, getting the facts on this case is very, very difficult. So at the end of the day, I think that we have to be very wary of the Western narrative and be clear that clearly what's happening in South China Sea is that we are now becoming sucked into a major geopolitical contest, which, by the way, will accelerate over the next 10 years, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. So the third part, therefore, is, I have 3 minutes. What do we do about it? And fortunately, there is a good answer for that. And that good answer was given by Jeffrey Sung and I, because we wrote a book called The ASEAN Miracle.
Yeah.
And what is shocking is that most people in Singapore are not aware that ASEAN is a miracle. And it's a miracle because what ASEAN has done is that it's taken the most diverse corner of planet Earth. By the way, there's no corner of planet Earth which is as interesting and as diverse and as different as Southeast Asia. Because out of 670 million people in Southeast Asia, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, and then you have Taoists, you have Confucianists, you have Hindus, and fortunately, you also have lots of communists. So, in Vietnam. So, it's an amazing, it's frankly, paradoxically, as a child growing up in Onan Road, my dream was to go overseas, to see Europe and see what I thought were the most interesting corners of planet Earth. But actually, it turns out I didn't know that I was living in Southeast Asia, which is frankly the most interesting corner of planet Earth. And so in such a place like this, which the British historians describe as the Balkans of Asia, we should be seeing more wars rather than less wars. We should not be seeing a war in Ukraine. We should be seeing a war here in Southeast Asia. The differences here are much greater. I mean, the Russians and Ukrainians share so much culture in common in every dimension. They have a deep connection with each other. Between the Muslims and the Christians, I assure you, there are huge differences. And you can see this in many parts of the world. And yet we are at peace. And this wasn't something that happened by accident. It happened because we had some really outstanding leaders, which we document in our book, in the 60s and 70s, who understood all the threats, anticipated it, and started creating this organization to deal with it. So the net result of it all is that you have today the world's second most successful regional organization called ASEAN in the world, in this region. And this is the organization that will essentially protect us from the US-China geopolitical contest. And that's why, if you look at a recent issue of the magazine Foreign Affairs, in the March-April issue, I have an article that makes the claim that if the rest of the world wants to manage the US-China contest, they can take lessons from one organization, and that organization is ASEAN. And I'm amazed that Foreign Affairs accepted that argument. But the tragedy is that while many in the rest of the world understand and appreciate ASEAN, we don't have enough people in Singapore who appreciate it. So I hope at the end of the day, you will all join me in marketing ASEAN to Singaporeans and to the world. Thank you.